All right, so this next section is on lymphoid cells and tissues. So the key concept is that lymphoid cells and tissue found in lymphoid organs are found in lymphoid organs and in connective tissue. So here are some cells that are found in lymphoid organs and in connective tissue. So one of the first ones is going to be our T cells. Our T cells can be one of two things. They can either be a immune messenger, in that case we call it a helper T cell, or it can attack invaders directly, so it can kill or destroy viruses and cancer cells mostly. And those ones we call cytotoxic T cells. So if they're immune messenger, they are a helper T cell. If they are a fighter, they're going to be a cytotoxic T cell. And we're going to talk more about those designations when we get into the immune system. But I guess I could write that down for now. So if it's an immune messenger, we call it a helper T cell. But if it attacks invaders directly, we call it a cytotoxic T cell. Alrighty. The other kind of cell type that we have are B cells. So these are both lymphocytes. So we have a T cell lymphocyte and a B cell lymphocyte. B cell lymphocytes, their job is to make antibodies against foreign proteins. And actually what they do is they make copies of themselves. And the daughter cells end up being called plasma cells. And the plasma cells are the ones that make the antibodies, but they are essentially just copies of the B lymphocytes. So plasma cells make the antibodies. And the antibodies are there to recognize and get rid of foreign proteins, okay? Or the other word that we call these things that you'll probably use more often is antigens. And again, remember, B cells and T cells, our lymphocytes, are trained to differentiate from self antigens and non-self or foreign antigens. And then macrophages, these are highly modified phagocytic monocytes. So in the blood, they're called monocytes, but when they're out in the tissues and in organs like the spleen, which we're going to talk about, they're called macrophages. So they are highly specialized and modified phagocytic monocytes that we find outside of blood vessels. Okay. And then one other thing I want to mention is that you'll notice here is a lymphocyte here. And it just says lymphocytes. There's not a specialized, there's not a T lymphocyte or a B lymphocyte on this particular diagram, because underneath the microscope and by just looking at the cell itself, you cannot tell the difference between a B cell lymphocyte and a T cell lymphocyte. They are all different, and they're going to have differences in their molecular, like microscopic structure. But from the outside, you cannot tell the difference between a B cell lymphocyte and a T cell lymphocyte. Okay, that's all I want to say about that. All right, so next are what we call reticular cells. So this is another type of cell we find in lymphoid organs. So reticular cells, which you see right here. These are like fibroblasts, which you should have learned in Bio 32, but these are fibroblast or fibrocyte, but fibroblast-like cells. You remember fibroblasts are the type of cells, or fibrocytes, depending on your professor, but it should be fibroblasts. But fibroblasts are the type of cells that you find within connective tissue proper, including dense regular connective tissue, which you should have learned in Bio 32. But again, these reticular cells are fibroblast-like. And what their job is to do is to make reticular fibers. And those reticular fibers are used to make a network of those fibers called a stroma. Now, this is not the only place where we're going to have a stroma. We'll talk about stroma when we get to the respiratory system as well. But stroma is essentially a network or mesh. I'll make this bigger so mesh is all together. A mesh of fibers that support other cells in lymphoid tissue. And the main cells that we're going to find in lymphoid tissue are lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are a major one. That's why it's called the lymphatic system, right? Lymphocytes are a major main cell type in our lymphatic organs, or lymphocytes. But also macrophages play a big role as well. So those are two big players, with lymphocytes being the star of the show. But macrophages play a big role as well. But lymphocytes and macrophages are supported by this reticular network or stroma. All right. So again, lymphocytes are our main type of cell found in the lymphatic system. Ooh, trying to circle some stuff. Okay, so lymphocytes are our main one that are found in lymphatic tissue. These are like our immune warriors. They're the ones that are really going to be the stars of our immune system in fighting off infections. All right. I'm going to erase this. If you need to pause, because I'm going to erase all this stuff. And if we take a look at this image here, so you can see a macrophage. Here are the reticular cells that make the reticular fibers that are going along here. And you see some lymphocytes as well. So they kind of just are anchored to this network so that they have a place to be and carry out their functions. I'm doing this a lot, I don't know why. Okay, so now we talked about lymphoid cells, so our lymphocytes and macrophages, and also those reticular cells. But now we're going to talk about primary versus secondary lymphoid organs. So our primary lymphoid organs, let's talk about primary first. Our primary lymphoid organs are where our lymphocytes mature. Now, lymphocytes are blood cells, so they're all made within red bone marrow, but where they mature is going to be different. So, and it makes it easy by their name. So B cells, and they're called B for this reason, B cells mature in the red bone marrow. So B cells. So B for bone. So B cells mature in the red bone marrow, while our T cells mature in the thymus. So that's why they're named T cell for thymus, B cell for bone. That's where they mature. That's where they're going to develop what's called immunocompetence, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in a couple slides. But that's where they're going to be able to tell what's self and what's non-self. And that's their maturation process is all training on how to be immune cells. Okay, secondary lymphoid organs are where these lymphocytes are going to encounter their antigen. Lymphocytes encounter antigen. Because we have many different lymphocytes that are suited to fight off many different types of antigens, but they're not going to get activated until they encounter that antigen. And once they encounter their antigen that they're supposed to be set to kill, then they can become activated and make more copies of themselves. So essentially all of our lymphocytes are like a trained assassins who have a picture of who their target is. Okay, so all of our lymphocytes are going to be specific to a specific antigen, and as soon as they encounter that antigen, then they become activated. So our secondary lymphoid organs are where lymphocytes encounter their antigens, where they get activated essentially. And so we have lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are a big one. We're going to talk about that. We're going to have a whole section here in a second on lymph nodes. Then we have our tonsils, and I'll talk about this in a second, but you have your tonsils, your Peyer's patches, and your appendix. These are all part of a group called MALT, and we'll have a whole section on MALT as well. It's mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So it's basically all of the clusters of lymphoid tissue that we have within mucous membranes. So one of the mucous membranes we have is a mucous membrane lining our digestive tract. And so we have clusters of lymphoid tissue in those areas. So at the tonsils is one area where we have MALT, or basically clumps of lymphoid tissue. Peyer's patches, which we're going to find in our intestines, small intestines specifically, and then our appendix as well. So these are all considered MALT because they're associated with the mucous membrane. Peyer's patches specifically, they are very similar to lymph nodes. So all Peyer's patches and really all malt, but Peyer's patches specifically. They are a cluster of cells, similar but not the same, similar to lymph nodes. And we'll talk about this in a second, but the function of lymph nodes is to survey fluid that flows through them, capture anything that doesn't belong, and destroy it. So survey, capture, and destroy. The same thing is going to be happening at these malt tissues. So at the tonsils, at the Peyer's patches, at the appendix, as fluid flows through, you're going to have lymphocytes that are going to be trying to tell, does this belong to this body or does it not belong to this body? And then it's going to capture and destroy anything that doesn't belong. So survey, capture, destroy. That's the big three things that are happening within lymph nodes and the lymphatic system. Okay, and another one that we're going to talk about as far as a secondary lymphoid organ goes is the spleen. This is another place where lymphocytes can encounter their antigens and become activated in order to get rid of whatever that potential threat is. Alrighty. So primary is where lymphocytes mature. Secondary is where lymphocytes find the antigen, the thing that doesn't belong, and we try to get rid of it. Okay. All right, so that's where we're going to stop here, and then the next video will be on lymph nodes.